going to be looking at chapter 5 from Dr. Russell's book, God's Plan, the Old Testament Narratives. Now, we did talk a little bit about genre, and for the balance of this series, we'll be looking at the Bible through the lens of different types of genre. We're looking at narratives, law, prophets, etc. Today we're going to be looking at what we call Old Testament narratives. We looked in an earlier lesson at the way in which we look at the Bible from the what's in it for me personally perspective. As we look at scriptural narratives, particularly in the Old Testament, we need to understand that the biblical worldview is that man is not in charge. God is. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and He is sovereignly controlling the events and the history of the universe. We know this because we see Him as He is intimately involved with His creation to bring this about. Now, the narrative passages reveal to us a God that is shaping history and is guiding it towards His preordained end. He planned it, and He will bring it to pass. What the Old Testament narratives show us is that God co-labors with and through His people. Let's take, for example, the exile, where Judah was taken captive to Babylon. Only God could do for Israel what has never been done to any other country ever, and that is to destroy a nation and to bring it back as that same nation. God's original plan was that we would be co-rulers with Him in the Garden of Eden. Unfortunately, sin marred that possibility. But even there, God predicted coming human history by promising a Messiah in Genesis 3:15. Later, in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, we see a foreshadowing of that through Abraham. And He promised that through Abraham's seed, we would be blessed. The promise, again, of a coming Messiah. We are formed spiritually when we connect with what God is doing and what His agenda for humanity is. The New Testament clarifies this, but the Old Testament record is its beginning in history and God's structuring of that agenda. Now, how do we become spiritually formed by narratives in history? Well, I think most of us love a good story. That is why movies are so popular and many books are very popular. Over half of the Bible is made up of stories. So if we want to understand the Bible, we need to understand how biblical narratives work. Now, there are 3 levels of narrative in history. At the lowest level, these are stories of individuals, which are important and offer models, both good and bad. At the middle level, we have the story of God's people, which are most important for identity and heritage. And then we have the top level. That is the eternal, universal plan of God, which is most important for understanding life. Now, what we need to understand in these stories is God is the hero. We tend to view the stories from the individual level. The problem is that Scripture wasn't written to be understood at this level. We look at individuals as the main part of the story, and we tend to want to emulate them even when they might not be giving us the best of examples. For example, we see examples of polygamy in the Old Testament. Or how about this one, Gideon's fleece? Gideon's fleece is an example of his lack of faith and is not to be imitated. But how often do we hear, I have my fleece out, as if it's the wise thing? It isn't. The story of Gideon is not about finding out God's will for our lives. It is seeing how God used even a faithless person such as Gideon to bring about His will in conquering the unbelieving Midianites as well as the Amalekites. With stories, what we want to do is take a big bite. This is only logical, isn't it? A story, all stories have a beginning, a middle, an end, and usually there's a resolution of some type within the story. We wouldn't think of reading a novel any other way than by starting at the beginning and reading the entire story. It's the same way with a biblical narrative. We have to read the entire story to get the point of what God is saying. When we do this, we can avoid a common error of interpretation. That's what we call allegory. Taking the literal and making it metaphor. Let me give you some examples. The 10 plagues are 10 problems in our lives. The storm on the Sea of Galilee represents the storm in our lives. You can see this in Mark chapter 4, where Jesus awoke and spoke to the sea and said, "Peace, be still," and the wind ceased, and there was great calm. The point for that particular story is how Jesus is moving forward as a part of God's plan and will not be hindered by Satan. The specific contribution of Old Testament narratives and histories to our spiritual formation is as follows. You can see a list of books that are covered on page 113 of Playing with Fire. Their primary contribution is to inform and to shape our worldview about the eternal plan that God is working out universally in human history, and also understanding continuity with the children of Israel as the people of God. Therefore, ask yourself, what does this passage tell us about God, who's the hero, his plan, or the role that his people should be playing in his plan? The secondary contribution, to give us positive and negative models of old covenant believers in making decisions to trust God, or if you will, to not trust him. Therefore ask, what positive or negative model might this passage be setting before us to teach us about trusting God in the midst of his plan? How to be spiritually formed by a narrative. Take the narrative of David and Goliath. Well, first it's a larger story. And we see in 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 8, the life and the ministry of Samuel. Chapter 9, the people ask for a king. Chapters 9 through 31, Saul is king, but he's rejected by God in chapter 15. Chapter 16 through 31, David is anointed king and yet serves Saul until his death in chapter 31. Now, most of us think of the story of David and Goliath. We don't want to take that out of isolation, what God is doing in history of Israel. We often focus on chapter 17, and what we will do is, this is a story about the little guy beating up the big guy, but that's not the point of the story at all. Let me read you the point in chapter 17, verses 45 through 47. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the army of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give you the carcasses of the Philistines' army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you all into our hands." So if we read those verses in the larger context, what we see that this is the story about the greatness of God and the faithfulness of David. So in conclusion, everybody loves a good story. So when you're reading the Bible's Old Testament narratives, keep in mind that God is the hero. Look to see how he is using time and people and circumstances to expand his kingdom.